Greetings, friends. My name is Emmanuel Wa-Kyendo. We're here looking at policy questions today. Now, this series is about a recent pre-budget hearing hosted by the Institute of Economic Affairs Kenya, inviting guests representing the sector, the private sector, and civil society. And the objective was to bring out perspectives on what the private sector and the civil society think should be on Kenya's next budget, and then to have even some commentary from representatives of the government, members of parliament and such. So today's video is about what arguments were made in support of the budget priorities proposed by advocates for the education sector, the banking sector, the agriculture sector, and ICT, right? So what were the arguments that were made? Basically, I stated in the previous video that this is not an exhaustive representation of all the sectors of Kenyan society, but rather it's just a representation of it helps us sort of understand where Kenya is from this particular set of eyes, and to understand and to sort of suss out what could be the cross-cutting themes, what are the cross-cutting problems, and then what's in addition to whatever is specific to each of these sectors. So the education sector. Now, Kenyan schools are organized by cluster. Cluster 1 schools are former national schools. Cluster 2 schools are former extra county schools. Cluster 3 schools are former county schools, and Cluster 4 schools are former sub-county schools. These clusters are categorized in terms of resource endowment. So you can expect that the higher the cluster, right? The Cluster 1 schools have more endowments than Cluster 4 schools. So 86% of Cluster 1 schools have operational libraries, right? And 59.5% of Cluster 1 schools have libraries linked to online resources. In stark contrast, only 20.7% of Cluster 4 schools had operational libraries. With regards to ICT resource ownership, Cluster 4 schools were, for the overwhelming part, consistently under-resourced. ICT resources include televisions, LCD projectors, teacher digital service devices, computer labs connected to the internet, radios, VCD or DVD players, and operational computer labs. While on average, 92.1% of Cluster 1 schools offered computer lessons to students, only 17.3% of Cluster 4 schools offered computer lessons to their students. Finally, while 15% of teachers in Cluster 1 schools were trained in special needs education, only 0.8% of Cluster 4 schools teachers were trained in special needs education. So that just gives us a broad view. And the point is, poorer schools, I mean, the disparity in resource allocations is huge. Now, let me see if I can pull up a quick chart just to show what this looks like, right? So this is from the presentation made by some of those who presented. Now I'm just trying to pull it up. Okay, while that pulls up, there we go. So, this is just an example. I think that's visible, right? So this is a presentation created by, his name is Stephen Maende from the Usawa Agenda. So this is his work. Now look at this chart. Cluster 1 schools. This is labs by category. And you can see Cluster 1 schools have, on average, much more, like right, 94% of Cluster 1 schools, for example, have chemistry labs. 81% have biology labs. 92% have physics labs. Now, as you go to Cluster 3 and 4, what do you see? A lot more shared or multi-purpose labs. So it's not a lab that's dedicated to that, but it's like it's shared. Private schools had fewer resources, right, than the average Cluster 1 schools in terms of laboratories. So you can see, for example, 30% of private schools had chemistry labs, while 94% of Cluster 1 schools had chemistry labs. So this is, like, in terms of data, it's a representation of why those national schools, right, are very attractive to those looking for secondary school education, and why it's so competitive. Because if you can afford it, right, and if you can afford it, you have the grades for it, then that's where the students want to be. Then, and that is true all the way even up to Cluster 3, right, where on average Cluster 3 schools are still just a little bit more better resource than private schools. So that's just one sign. And now we could look at another one. Look at this chart. Schools with an operational library. So Cluster 1 schools, again, they have more libraries. Same with ICT resources. So you could sort of see the disparity. Now, what about the banking sector? So the Kenya Bankers Association asserted that the problem whereby Kenyan commercial activity slows before every election should be resolved. They were concerned especially by this problem. Now, this problem could be better framed as a negative outcome that results from a failure in nation building, itself resulting from unstable institutions and anxiety, and then the failure to build a nation also creates these very unstable institutions and engenders anxieties around the electoral process that issue in the suppression of commercial activities. In the last 5 years, the purchasing power of Kenyans has declined, with real wages contracting by 12% and taxes and levies on wages continuing to expand. Although the association blamed the decline in real wages for contributing to an unstable political and economic environment, it is the economic environment as conditioned by institutional failures, featuring excessive regulation, a complex a tax regime featuring high tax rates and complexity in terms of the regime itself, and all this being levied against a small base that are the ultimate cause together of Kenya's economic and political woes, right? So although the Kenyan Bankers Association asserted that lowered tax rates will cause increases in tax revenue collection, and this may well be true with regards to the dynamic responses to taxes, taxes are not in and of themselves a desirable or moral duty. They're not a desirable reality or a moral duty. By an orthodox economic prescription, taxes should be levied to produce public goods alone and nothing more. The distortionary effects that taxes impose on an economy cannot be justified beyond the provision of public goods. The argument for lower tax rates is, therefore, primarily an argument for the expansion of economic freedoms. The Kenya Bankers Association's assessment that high rates of youth unemployment can result in social unrest is sensible. Their argument that their employment expands the tax base can be read as a parochial perspective on the relationship between the state and the public interests. In other words, this position gives the impression that firms and households exist to pay taxes. And other proposals also in line with industry interests include the promotion of engagement in economic activities via small-scale private financing, and the promotion of youth access to finance via an enabling environment and partnerships with the government. So the Kenya Bankers Association seems to think that people will make a lot of noise that the government doesn't want if they don't have jobs, and the way to get people to quiet down is to give them jobs. That's the impression, in a way. Now, it's not to say that they're making an argument in bad faith. Let's be clear about that. But rather, that they're making an argument based on this assumption that we're always trying to placate the government in making proposals to the government. And we're always trying to make it look like, hey, if you do this, this is in your, this is going to work in your favor. We'll explore that a little bit more, but about how that is actually part of this idea that civic engagement is about appeasing a government. A government is treated like a father, some type of deity who always must be placated. Everything we say, we've got to say how it benefits them, how it's a good thing for them, when really it shows us two things. First, that we don't understand that the government is there to represent the citizen, but also second, it could also represent the reality that without greater public engagement, those making proposals are actually reduced to placating the government as an important tactic, a useful tactic to get the government to sort of see the incentive in a policy. So it could also issue out of just pure pragmatism. Proposals that urge government intervention in the markets can be sound in accordance with Keynesian principles. That is, there is a time and place for government interventions that help address inefficiencies. That being said, it is not clear that economic inefficiencies had been identified here. The proposals for reduced taxation are in line with economic principle. Other proposals included direct interventions to incentivize employers to hire more youths and tax schemes for employers to support youth employment. So firms should be given leeway to resort to their own requirements when hiring. The Kenyan Bankers Association's proposals exhibited distrust for free market allocations. So let me just pull up essentially some of what they said. Now, this is the presentation by the Kenyan Bankers Association, just to have a taste. So these are their major points, right? Declining wages, inflation, taxes, right? And then the relationship, what does it actually do to the country? And that their solution is we need measures that actually improve the purchasing power of Kenyans. So you can see they're concerned about Kenya's instability. This is a concern that's probably shared by many. The problem you have is Kenya's political actors are not sufficiently incentivized to actually take actions that build the nation. So the incentive has to also come from the citizens themselves. Now, basically, let's see. What is important to note is this. We have to be careful about conflating disagreement for political instability, and that everything is about the economy. It's not a negative thing that people disagree, right? That's not a bad. It's the nature of democracy, of the democratic process. Democratic process is about giving room for disagreement. It doesn't matter that people or rather that people disagree is a feature of the design of democracy, of the democratic process, and not a bug. And it's so we don't it but it's not necessary to use disagreement, right? The event that is disagreement to say then to support and say, look, we need better economic policy so that the disagreements die down. No, we need better economic policy because we need better economic policy. We need stronger institutions because stronger institutions, there's all the manner of arguments about how they deliver better welfare. That doesn't mean that these are measures that should be taken in order just to reduce disagreement. No. The agriculture sector itself, Kenya's 2022-2027 administration had pledged to prioritize food security, the reduction of food imports, and the increase of exports, all in a bid to increase farmers' income and create jobs. The sector financing is dominated by public sector funding, a pattern also reflected in Kenya's public sector domestic borrowing. Kenya's government is crowding out the private sector. Although they propose that agriculture sector expenditures be raised, citing the nominal stagnation and real contractions in allocations, agricultural sector advocates did not present a compelling defense of the Malabo Accords. So I called them Cotonou earlier, or maybe it was in a previous video, but actually it's the Malabo Accords. The accords that nations should spend at least 10% of their budget on agriculture. The advocacy group cited a FuseNet report that food insecurity will see 3.5 million Kenyans requiring food assistance by May 2026. The work of economist Amartya Sen demonstrates that food security has an important demand component. That is, we have to be careful to note the difference when people, the difference between droughts and famine, right? So in famine, I want to make sure I get this right. There's a difference between people starving because they cannot afford to buy food and people starving because there's a deficit in food supply, as is often assumed by those who make arguments in support of food security. The group asserted that agriculture sector's significant contributions to Kenya's economy have earned it the right to outsized government support. So, when people are starving, should we make sure that we have stocks of food available to feed them, or is it better to have stocks of money reserved so when people go hungry you direct money to them and then they can go and buy food, right? And I would lean on the latter. Have a food security can be defined in terms of, and should be defined in terms of, access, and access itself being determined by income primarily, right? So make sure that you have policies that are inducing socioeconomic mobility, and then at the same time have reserves ready to be directed to these people when they go hungry and don't have money to buy food. So the assertion that agriculture sector's significant contribution to Kenya's economy have earned it a right to outsized government support contravenes economic logic that limits government intervention to market failures, information symmetry, the provision of public goods, and the emergence of negative externalities. So agriculture funding allocations are themselves set to drop from 84 billion shillings to 47 billion shillings between financial year 2024-25 and 2025-26. Overall trends included fiscal pressure that reduced government spending, fragmentation in allocations between national and county governments, sometimes manifesting in parallel competing programs, and politically motivated subsidy programs, and finally the adverse effects of climate change. Let's see if I can pull up just to sort of demonstrate the gist of the arguments being made. So the recommendations by this sector is protect development spending, improve coordination, expand climate smart investments. Now, some of this requires even more in-depth exploration than when it comes to climate smart investments, right? There's a lot more science and deeper economic analysis involved in that. Improve coordination, we can see that one. The sector seems to identify that the counties and the national government have run parallel programs. Yes, where coordination can actually result in cost ineffectiveness. This needs to be addressed. It's not clear that constrained funding just in and of itself, right? Constrained allocations are a negative. We would need to dive deeper into that argument, but you can see development versus recurrent imbalances. There's both a fact of stress, but also on the other side, we need to note that there's a difference between supply and demand. The demand side, the consumers, the households. Households shouldn't have to be restricted to consuming food grown in Kenya. They should have access to food from anywhere in the world where it's cheaper. And that's one problem with the some of the features of Kenya's trading regime, where you're making it so difficult to import sugar when households are spending more than 50% of their incomes on food. Make it cheaper for households to access this food. So do not define food security in terms of the fact whether or not you can grow everything at home, but rather define it by what households actually have access to around the world, and the choice, the consumer choice. What about cyber sector arguments? So Kenya's ICT sector has seen mobile subscriptions surpass 65 million users for penetration level just above 120%. This and many other metrics attest to increasing growth in the market for digital products. Constraints affect reliability, inclusivity, resilience, and integrity, right? One important proposal made by sector policy advocates was the creation of a fund to address issues like cybersecurity and AI innovation. And that would be, but the problem is that this would be exposed to Kenya's existing institutional challenges, right? In Kenya's political economy, funds are not transparent and are used by officials for activities unrelated to their original mandate. So, for example, a member of parliament shouldn't have a budget under their control, because this is actually giving them an executive function. So, and then the fact that these funds are usually not transparent is a problem. Now, ICT sector proposals for the domestication of data raise suspicions in a country where data has been availed to state and non-state actors to perpetuate contraventions against human and economic freedoms and to exact extra-legal forms of rendition of persons and then violence. Domestication of data also contravenes free market principles governing property rights. Data belongs to people, not governments. So basically, ICT sector proposals, one of their features was, hey, we need to domesticate data. But remember that Kenya is a country where the state will actually access data by, say, a provider like Safaricom and use this data to perform extra legal renditions, right? That's a fancy way of saying kidnapping, and actually kill people, right? And you can look at different reports, look at what Amnesty International reports, the BBC, etc. Now, what about the manufacturing sector? Manufacturing in Kenya remains a costly, regulations-ridden enterprise. Although Kenya's manufacturing sector is the formal sector's highest wage employer and accounts for 11.5% of Kenya's total employment, formal employment, and makes 18% of Kenya's tax contributions, unstable and unpredictable policies, the high cost of industrial inputs, illicit trade, the heavy regulatory burden, the high cost of energy, and cash flow constraints all contribute to the increasing uncompetitiveness of the sector. Kenya is also experiencing premature deindustrialization. The burden imposed by regulatory overreach and a poor business environment characterized by falling purchasing power of consumers, high lending rates, high inflation, and a real effective exchange rate that has experienced a near 25-year descent all bode ill for the sector. Kenya's market remains quite unfree. So that ends this session, where we were basically looking at the proposals made by different representatives of different sectors of Kenyan society and the proposals that they were making. So now we can, and that ends that video. So thank you so much. Cheers, post your questions, comments, and let's